George Freeman and Bill Schmidt.
Thank you very much, George. Welcome to Tucson.
Thank you. Great to be here.
That is a great, worthy, earnest, admirable film. And by the way, a great prequel to All the President's Men, which we just showed here a month ago with that terrific ending at the Watergate. So, George, I have to ask you, as a lawyer steeped in the values of the First Amendment and someone who knows this story, would you, if you were making a movie about the Pentagon Papers, is this the movie that you would have made?
No. It's really actually a forceful and engaging and I think powerful movie. The problem is, at least from my point of view, and you might view me as parochial, the movie should have been about the Times, and the Times basically published the Pentagon Papers. The Post had sloppy seconds, and then you saw a lot of papers had thirds and fourths. But it was the Times that got the papers. It's the Times that spent 3 months figuring out what we saw here in a matter of 24 hours. How to print it, whether to print it, to devise a legal strategy, and then to be the first one sued in court. The joke at the Times, and the Times people who actually worked on the Pentagon Papers are kind of irate over all this. The joke at the Times is that when Spielberg does a movie about Watergate, it's going to be called the Times. Because of course it was the Post that led the way in that one. The other problem I have with it, though, is really almost a bigger problem. And that is that this is a docudrama. And a docudrama is really quite fetching from a Hollywood and from a movie audience's point of view. But you leave without knowing what actually you saw was true and what wasn't. I mean, the general gist was true, but there are many things in this movie that were made up for the good of Hollywood, for the good of the drama, for the good of condensation. And I feel that it's misleading at best and kind of nerve-wracking at worst to not know when you leave what really happened and what didn't. And so if I were making a movie, I would have, I think, tried to stay as loyal as I could to the actual historical record, rather than, for example, having a young intern run up to see what Neil Sheehan was up to. That's pure fiction. Rather than have that scene where Bradley goes into her office and says, look, all these papers have followed you, which couldn't possibly have been true because the Post followed the Times. And actually it was Ellsberg that gave the papers, the Pentagon Papers, to all the other newspapers. It's not Ben Bendikian who basically went out and sought him. Nixon, for example, was not angry at the beginning. He was happy at the publication of the Pentagon Papers. Not only was it the evening, the afternoon of his daughter's wedding, or the day after his daughter's wedding, he was still in a good mood, but the papers blamed mainly the Democrats, Johnson and Kennedy, his two arch enemies. He still blamed Kennedy for stealing the 1960 election, and he and Johnson hated each other. And the papers blamed them for the morass in Vietnam. So he thought politically and personally this was a good thing. And the movie didn't show that. They showed him angry at the very start. So I would have tried to be truer to the historical record, because I think when you leave, you really want to know what happened and what didn't. And here it's a melange, and it's hard to tell.
It would have been nice if they had at least put Neil Sheehan in the movie as a character and had somebody play him in a cameo, so he got his part. George, let me ask you about another piece of the film, which, while it's clearly a film about a battle between newspapers and the government over these leaked documents, there are times in the film that it feels like it's a battle between the lawyers and the journalists. And I know that, for example, and you can tell us if this is true or not, but I had read that Lord, Day & Lord, which was the big law firm that represented the Times, they actually quit representing the Times just shortly before the Times agreed to publish the papers, because they were so concerned that the Times was going to violate the law. So it was a real issue. But tell me, from the standpoint of a First Amendment lawyer, I'm a big, I think First Amendment lawyers are heroes, but you kind of come off as bad guys in this film.
You came across as evil in this film, that's true. No, but what you say is actually true. The law firm at the Times, Lord Day & Lord, had been the Times lawyers since 1910. And the general counsel of the Times, Jim Goodale, when he first learned that the Times had these papers and was contemplating publication, which was back in about March, went to the firm and said, "I'd like you to start studying the question because there are obviously some legal issues here." And the firm refused to study the question, refused to accept delivery from the general counsel of the Times of the papers to be able to get familiar with them, and refused to do anything. And so Goodale basically had to do it himself. And then when they got the telegram from Attorney General Mitchell, soon to be going to jail, by the way, asking them to stop publication, and got sued the next day, had to be in court the day after, he went back to the firm and said, "Listen, now we have to be in court. I really need your help." And the firm was afraid not only of the Times' exposure, but of their own exposure, because they thought they could be incriminated in national security violation. And so they again refused. I mean, they refused their client of 60 years from, and didn't take this incredibly important case. Needless to say, that was the last First Amendment case they handled for the Times. And the Times switched then to the firm that I ended up working for, which is how I got there. But it's actually a great story. What happened is that Goodale then found that he didn't have a lawyer and he had to be in court the next day. So what was he going to do? He couldn't be in court himself. He really was not a litigator, and he can't do this as a one-man show. So he had met a Yale law professor named Alexander Bickel a couple of weeks prior, and had asked Bickel, who was a constitutional law scholar, what he thought about kind of a hypothetical case of something like the Pentagon Papers. And apparently Bickel gave him a good answer. So he decided he was going to find Bickel and have Bickel be his lawyer. The problem was Bickel was a professor at Yale. He called Yale. There was no answer. Now, I know it might surprise some of you, but in 1971, there was no voicemail. There was no faxes. There was no email. You could,
rotary phones in everybody's home.
If the phone didn't answer, you couldn't do much about it. And he needed a lawyer right away because he had to be in court at 9:30 the next morning. So he went down to the newsroom. I think this was the smartest move that anyone did. He went to the newsroom and said, "Listen, your job is to ferret out the news. I want you to ferret out Alexander Bickel. Find him. I need to talk to him." And within 10 minutes, a reporter found him with his mother on the west side of New York. And so he called him and said, "I need you to be my lawyer on this big case." And Bickel said, "Well, I'd love to, but I have two problems." I said, "What's that?" "Well, one is that, I can't do it alone. I need a law firm behind me." And Goodale said, "No problem, we'll get the law firm." And the second was, "Well, I've never been in court myself. I'm a law professor, so I kind of study the law, but I've never litigated a case." And Goodale said, "Oh, no problem, you'll learn on the job." And so that was the Times' lawyer, a guy who had never been in court. Meanwhile, the next morning, the U.S. attorney in New York, who was prosecuting the case for the Nixon administration, called up his deputy and said, "I need you to be in court to prosecute a case against the Times." And the lawyer said, "Well, I've been working on a drug case for you, sir, and I haven't even had time to read the Pentagon Papers, so I don't think I'd be a very good choice." And the boss said, "Well, why don't you read them on the subways on the way down, and get a little familiar with it?"
7,000.
So he, well, at least the part that the Times had published. It turned out he wasn't even allowed to read the Pentagon Papers for another week because he didn't have the necessary security clearances. So the government's own lawyer couldn't read what he was arguing about because he didn't get the sufficient clearance. And then the judge was a judge who had been a federal judge for one day. This was his second day on the job. So in the greatest clash in our history between the press and the government, you had one lawyer who had never been in court, the opposing lawyer didn't know the first thing about the facts, and a brand new judge.
And one thing this film makes a clear point of is that the stakes, actually, and what the lawyers were warning of, were quite high. They were trying to enforce the Espionage Act, and I've read a great quote from Punch Sulzberger, the publisher of the Times, that while this discussion was going on in the Times about what the consequences might be of printing these papers, he said, the more I heard them talk about it, the more the whole thing smelled like 20 years to life to me. So there was real fear that they could go to prison if they were in fact convicted of the Espionage Act. One of the other things that this movie is about, Because I don't want this to be
Let me say one thing, Bill, to that. The case actually was not a prosecution. The Times couldn't have ended up in jail. This case was about a prior restraint, stopping publication, which was the First Amendment defenses really are the strongest. But 4 justices, in their opinion, suggested that the Times Post could actually be prosecuted. Right. And it never happened. And I asked the prosecutor, well, if Nixon kind of wanted to prosecute and the justices invited it, how come it didn't happen? And he said, well, they asked me to do it. They asked me to prosecute the Times, and I told the White House no. And I said, well, why'd you say no to the White House? They're your boss, kind of. And he said, because I'm a litigator and I don't like to lose. And the chance of the Nixon administration winning this case in New York against the Times during the unpopular war was a loser, and I wasn't going to take the case.
In addition to this being...
I'm sorry, one other last thing. Ellsberg, on the other hand, was prosecuted. I mean, because he didn't have the same defenses as the Times did, because he illegally distributed the classified material to the Times. And he was dead to rights. He really had almost no defenses other than some jury nullification, that the jury would feel that he did the right thing morally. But he was going to lose the case. And the case went to trial. Was about to go to trial, actually. And what happened was he was dead to rights, and he knows he would have gone to jail. And when he gave the papers to the Times, he knew that he would be going to jail. But he felt so morally that he had to, strong, that he had to end the war, and he thought he was in a position where he had to do this. But what happened was that even though he would have lost, the government, the judge threw the case out for prosecutorial misconduct. As you may recall, the government broke into his shrink's office to get dirt on him. And what's less known than that is that there were 2 calls from, I think, Ehrlichman or Haldeman or Nixon's associates offering the judge, essentially offering the judge the directorship of the FBI after J. Edgar Hoover either retired or died. And at that point, the judge threw the case out for prosecutorial misconduct, and Ellsberg said it was the happiest day of his life. He faced 116 years, I believe.
You know, when this film came out, there was a reviewer who was trying to figure out why it was that Spielberg chose to make a movie about the Pentagon Papers focusing on the Washington Post. And of course, part of it is that it's very much a movie about Katharine Graham. And it's a movie about women. And in fact, the original screenplay for this film was actually a screenplay written about Katharine Graham's character. Spielberg had the screenplay redone and refocused the movie. And one reviewer said that the film was Spielberg's effort to commandeer yesterday to comment on today. So George, what is it that, that you think Spielberg saw in this drama, the Pentagon Papers drama, that was so relevant today?
Well, it's really relevant, and there are parts that I watched today. I'd seen the movie, half a year ago, which really resonate as to what's going on, literally today in Washington. One thing I just would mention that really, if you think about it, I mean, if Spielberg had Meryl Streep lined up, I think the only woman who would have been in this movie, if the movie had been about the Times, there was a leading researcher who was working for the reporters, who was in that suite at the Hilton. She would have been on screen for about 20 seconds, but other than that, Meryl Streep would not have had a role, because at times the lawyers, the reporters, everyone else was male. So that's a pretty good reason. The other reason probably is that this all took place in 36 hours, whereas the Times, as I say, had the papers and was deciding what to do for 3 months. And from a movie perspective, it's a lot more drama to put it in a condensed period of time. But in answer to your question, Bill, I mean, it's terribly relevant because I guess 2 reasons generally. I mean, one is the attacks on the press that we see every day are, unprecedented in our country. I mean, Nixon, who obviously plays a role here, disliked the press, occasionally spoke out against the press. His vice president called the press the nattering nabobs of negativism, and that was a big deal. But that happened once. Today we hear it every single day, this mantra of fake news, which I think is a totally meaningless expression. and his hatred of the press. Actually, if you listen to the Nixon Watergate tapes and the Pentagon Papers section of the Nixon tapes, every time he mentions the New York Times and the Washington Post, there are about 5 expletives before it, words that I'm not going to mention here, that included religious expletives and others. So, I mean, he was no lover of the Times or the Post, but still, he didn't attack the press as mercilessly as the current president is. So, I mean, just the importance of the press in our society and a way to, you know, push back at the attack it's suffering every day, I think makes the movie very important to begin with. But secondly, I mean, there was a section there, I mean, there's a lot of sections about what really was at stake was the government, and Johnson in particular, lying to the country. And now we have a president who, according to the Washington Post, as of, I think, January 1st, had either lied or misspoke, you know, not told the truth over 6,000 times. And you have, you know, a Congress that really has been enabling him and certainly not combating him. You have a judiciary which I think would like to stand up to him, but more and more of that judiciary is being appointed by him. And you have the press. So really the press is really the only bulwark that has really taken measures and taken steps to block his initiatives and to criticize him and call a lie a lie. And so I think, and the government lying to the public is really what the Pentagon Papers is all about, why it's so important. And that's being repeated many times, you know, every day.
You know, just to widen the focus and picking up on that point, in 1971, we had an autocratic president who hated the press, and as you said, we're dealing with something very similar now. But one of the things that's changed between 1971 and now is the way people consume news, the way print journalism has collapsed, the power of big technology and the effects of Google and Facebook. You've got the Times and papers like the Times and the Post and PBS and other stalwart mainstream media that still believe facts matter a great deal. Yet the internet's a sewer now, and so much of the, so many people now believe that alternative facts matter as much as facts. So where does that leave the First Amendment and the importance of the press in your mind?
Well, I think I'd answer 2 ways. One is that the public really, it's up to kind of civic responsibility for readers and viewers to figure out who they can rely on and who they can't. I mean, if citizens believe that what they read on Facebook has as much credibility as what they read in the Washington Post, you know, I don't know what to do about that other than have better 4th grade classes in, you know, what to believe and in media, you know, responsibility. The real problem, though, I think is a little bit different, and that is that in 1970, Ellsberg spent a year trying to get congressmen to read the Pentagon Papers from the well of the Senate and the House, the anti-war congressmen. And they all refused. This was too hot. They would have gotten in trouble. They were scared. No one agreed to do it. Ellsberg went into a depression, and finally, as a last gasp, after a year of trying, he went to Neil Sheehan. So the Times had it. The Post then got it after the Times was stopped, because the Times actually wasn't stopped because there was a ruling against them. The judge just said, makes no sense for me to have this case for a week while you guys are publishing, because by then the case is moot. You've already put everything you were going to put out. So I want you to stop. The Times didn't agree to do it voluntarily, and the judge then ordered them to stop until the case was decided, which ended up being 16 days until the Supreme Court made its decision. But the thing is, when the Times or the Post had it, you could be pretty sure, as Ben Bradley was questioned, that they were worried about publishing anything that would injure the national security, that would injure the war efforts. And they had all these reporters vetting that material to make sure that wouldn't happen. And Ellsberg had no choice but to go to the mainstream media, because other than the congressman, that was the only way to distribute it to the public. Today, Julian Assange can put the Pentagon Papers or the materials he's somehow gotten on his own website, and anyone could put it on their website without having the filter of responsibility that, in my view, the mainstream media did have then and still has now. And to me, even though I'm supposed to be a First Amendment guy, that really is very dangerous, because then you could have stuff on there willy-nilly that really is harmful to the country, number one. And number two, if that ever gets published in that sense, it's going to lead to legislation that's going to cut back on anyone's ability to publish any of this stuff. So I view the internet as kind of a danger, that even though it makes it easier to publish, it allows publishers who don't have the responsibility of publishers to distribute material that might actually be quite injurious.
You know, picking up on that exact point, George, let's talk just a little bit about Whistleblowers, because this is a film also about whistleblowers, Daniel Ellsberg, who did this from a sense of conscience. Totally. And moral obligation that he felt these papers had to be leaked. And we've seen a lot of this recently. There's been Edward Snowden. There was Chelsea Manning and the WikiLeaks leaks. We seem to have a lot of leaking going on. We have people who break into emails now, hackers, and they leak constantly. So what can you say about leaking in general, and what kinds of burdens that now places on the press or on those who would still think of themselves as gatekeepers, as unfashionable as that term is now?
Yeah, I think it puts a lot of pressure on them, but I mean, I think leaking as such has been with us forever. Max Frankel, who was your boss at one time, editor of the Times, was the Washington bureau chief while this movie took place, these events took place, wrote an affidavit at the time of the Pentagon Papers case that was used in court that said, you know, what's the big deal? We get leaked information every day for all sorts of reasons. The Army leaks documents that makes the Navy look bad. A mid-level Secretary of Defense leaks materials because he doesn't like the policy of his boss. There are trial balloons that are leaked. I mean, people leak for political reasons, for their own personal reasons, and all of that does educate and bring more context to what government's doing. So generally speaking, it's been with us forever. It goes on. Why is everyone treating this so different? I mean, by the way, the whole point, this was really kind of an easy case because it really dealt with history. It didn't deal with what was going on the battlefield today. There were some volumes of the Pentagon Papers that dealt with the peace process, but Ellsberg didn't give those to the Times because he didn't want to tarnish the peace process. He wanted peace. So he never even gave those to the Times, although the government didn't know that. So I think leaking has been around, but it's really up to the publications. And again, this is why I get to the fact that the internet and some of the crazy cable channels maybe are problematic, because it's really up to the institutions, to the press, to decide what informations that they get are worth publishing. And the answer is not everything. I mean, the Times doesn't publish a lot of stuff it gets. You know, that's kind of a secret that the Times doesn't tell people. But for, you know, not wanting to hurt a police investigation or a prosecution, or for national security reasons, I mean, it really, at times, does not publish things or delays publication. You know, I'd like to think acts responsibly in deciding what and when things should be published. I just don't have confidence that, you know, some of the cable outlets, some of the websites, or, you know, Julian Assange, who I think is a nihilist and just kind of wants to publish for the sake of showing that he can do it and he can kind of make fun of government by doing that. That's not a very good filter, and I think that's problematic.
Well, in fact, and I don't know if you could speak to this, but in that first trove of documents, the Chelsea Manning leak that WikiLeaks Assange had given to The Guardian and the German publication The Times, there was a lot of tension between Assange and The Times about this. Assange wanted everything dumped. The Times refused to dump everything. I think The Guardian did as well, without being able to vet it. The same thing happened with the Pentagon Papers, in a sense. In some of my reading on the background of this, when the Times first got the Pentagon Papers, there were some people saying, how do we know that these documents weren't just all produced by a group of anti-war radicals in a hotel room somewhere? You had to find out that they were, in fact, authentic. And this period of 3 months that was going on before they even publish the papers.
Well, Abe Rosenthal, who was in the movie, who was the editor of the Times, then legendary editor, we did a 25th anniversary retrospective, and he said, when I questioned him what was his biggest problem, what was his biggest worry, he said that the Pentagon Papers were a hoax perpetrated by Harvard students. That's why they came from Boston. So yeah, you have to make sure they were authentic, number one. I mean, the Post didn't have to do that because the Times already had done their work for them.
Let me approach this question of the internet and of information and the role of the press from a slightly different angle, which is that with the kind of polarization in the country now, with the kind of tension between the press and the Trump administration, what impact do you think it's had on the press itself in terms of its own standards? Do you see the press changing in some ways as they've had to become more adversarial? Is that good or is it bad? Is the Times a different paper today than it was when you and I were at the Times 5 years ago?
Well, let me answer that with a really quick history lesson, because I think what's happened has been really a phenomenal change, and I think it's a change for the best, but there are other parts of it that are negative, I think. The change that's gone on, when you know, I was born, right, newspapers essentially were stenographers for the government. And the New York Times published every day the Agriculture Department reports, how soybeans were doing, you know, when the boats were docking at on the Hudson River. I mean, whatever government said, they republished. That was their job. That's started changing for the first time with Edward R. Murrow reporting on the demagoguery of Joseph McCarthy, which was in the early 50s, and then didn't really change anymore. So the stenography role still was the basic model until the early 70s, when the lying of Vietnam and the corruption of Watergate, and the lying during Watergate, basically changed the role of the press. And the press decided it couldn't just be a stenographer for a lying institution, but it was its duty to call the government on its lies. So that became kind of the new model in the 70s, that government was, I mean, the press was really supposed to be the monitor and the checkpoint of government lies and of what government was doing. And that was the model until, in my opinion, 2 years ago, when for the first time ever they went beyond that and called the candidate who was running for president of the United States a liar, which had never been done. I mean, the usual formula was, like President Bush, I give this example, gave a speech that he's the environmental president. This is Bush Sr. In Boston Harbor, you know, the shining blue ocean behind him. And what they did, they wouldn't say, well, no, he's not the environmental president. He still has all his friends from the oil industry who he's supporting. But they would basically say, he said he's the environmental president. And they'd have 5 quotes from people who had different positions. I mean, you probably wrote some stories like this, Bill. But they never would really say that he's full of crap. It's not true. It would just be kind of hinted and suggested through this backhanded formula that readers are supposed to pick up on. And so it was a monumental change when all of a sudden the Trump lies were so huge and so recurring that they just started calling Trump a liar. And to me, that's like the third change in what the model is. And it's really a significant change, but one that I think had to take place. Because otherwise, to me, the newspapers aren't really fulfilling their commitment to their readers and telling the readers what's going on and what the truth is. And if they really say that he's intentionally saying mistruths, you got to say that. You can't say that in some backhanded way that not all readers will understand or pick up on. So, you know, I think that's a big change, and that's what happened. Now, on the other hand, what happens then is they say, well, you're full of opinion. You're saying he's a liar. Newspapers shouldn't be giving their own opinions. And the truth of the matter is, I think they only say something like that when it's pretty clear it's not an opinion, but it really is fact. I mean, they know that he's saying untruths on purpose. On the other hand, there's no question that the Times and other papers are in competition with cable TV and with some of the websites that are much more lax in terms of what they publish. And so while there's still a greater filter, I would say, with the Washington Post and the New York Times, I think that filter has gotten narrower. And you know, things that were recipe, whatever, things are published now that wouldn't have been published earlier or would have taken more time. I mean, the Times always said when I was there, the internet is not going to change our timing on stories. We're going to wait until we're totally sure that they're accurate, just as we always have. And I don't work there anymore, so I can say I don't really 100% believe that. It would be against human nature because it's a competitive business, and they don't want, you know, BuzzFeed beating them on every story, because BuzzFeed goes to put something on the internet like that. They're not going to sit there for an extra 24 hours and wait till all the editing and the cycle. They've got rid of copy editors as kind of an example of that. So there's no question. It's not great for journalism, I don't think.
And yet, while you have so many organizations saying we are still committed to public service, we are still committed to a search for the truth, we're still going to be skeptical of what happens to the government, hold them accountable. Despite all of this, the last Pew survey of public opinion in the United States showed that only 32% of Americans trust the media or believe what they read.
Yeah, and that drives me crazy. I mean, I think it's important to distinguish, though. I think the problem is not in dealing with a story about the White House. I mean, the Times, I think, and the Post have done terrific reporting on this administration, and I don't think any of it is tarnished by the competition with the internet and so on. My problems with the internet are more in terms of the types of stories that go out. I mean, more gossipy and sensational stories that you wouldn't have had 10, 20 years ago, but now you have to have because everyone's battling for hits and, you know, visibility and so on. You know, that's kind of where we are. I mean, of
course, and then,
say your question again, Bill, your last question?
Well, the question was just despairing over the fact that only 32% of people trust the media.
So yeah, and the question is what you do about that. I mean, in effect, a movie like this is helpful. I would hope that would push the needle a little bit on the side of the media. A little bit. I was involved. I can tell you, though, it's more difficult than you think. I am involved in a campaign where the idea was to really do social media ads, because it's people who get news from social media, the people who really are the targets to kind of change their attitudes. So to do a social media campaign, which wouldn't be that expensive, to try to impress upon people that the press is really important to a democracy, is important to them as citizens. The problem is, we did research. I mean, we really were serious about this, did a lot of research. And the problem is that you couldn't use national news or Trump to kind of make any of your points. Because as soon as you mention Trump, everyone goes into their respective camps and no one's minds are going to be changed. So it's a very difficult situation. And everyone I spoke to accentuated that if you're going to make an ad campaign like this, you have to focus on local news. People generally like their local newspapers. You can find a lot of examples, you know, from bad water in Michigan to the Olympic medical abuse in Indianapolis. I mean, you can go all over the country with examples where local papers have really done great things for their communities. And I think that has to be the basis to get people to realize how important a free and independent press is. The other thing that kills me, and this is kind of a personal nature, is, I mean, I worked with people like Bill and, you know, reporters at the Times for 30 years. And they bust their chops to get everything as accurate and as correct as possible. And the notion that 50% of the people out there say, oh, fake news, is just horrifying because it's just so untrue. I mean, these are people who work day and night to get the facts as perfect as they can, but you're dealing with thousands of facts in every day's paper, so of course you're going to make a few mistakes. But the notion that people kind of believe that, oh, no one really cares and it's just fake news and people are just throwing in whatever they want is really horrifying to me.
You know, I think part of the problem is semantics too, is that when you talk to people about, I don't trust the media now, the first question you have to ask is, what media? You know, are you talking about my media, which is people who now go get their news from sites that are sites that play back news that reinforces their own interests? Are you talking about larger mainstream kinds of sites that have a different kind of obligation? So that's part of the confusion, because the media itself is fractured into dozens, hundreds of little pieces, and people are now going to each of their own little, they're into their own little bubbles. I want to give a chance for you all to ask some questions. Let me just ask you, George, one last question, and that is that in all of these other threats that we see now, or concerns we have about the media, the question of physical safety. We had an incident at a rally in El Paso last week where a BBC cameraman was attacked by somebody. And I read that up in Montana, the state legislature is actually considering legislation that would make it a crime to attack a reporter, that you would have higher penalties, possibility of more jail time. Ironically, this is happening in the state where, in fact, a politician did attack a reporter during an interview and then got elected to Congress. So maybe it's good politics. A focus group would show this is what you should do. But what do you think about the idea of giving reporters special protection?
I don't think I'm for it. I think it kind of signals out the media as being special, and even though we are special in terms of the constitutional role we have as the fourth estate, I don't think that's the public perception we want to carry out, that we need special protections. I think, you know, if reporters are going to places, there ought to be the proper security, but mainly we ought to have a president who doesn't egg people on to do these sort of things. And that's really what the danger is right now.
Great. Do we have any questions from any of you in the audience for Mr. Freeman?
Yeah, Mr. Freeman, I take it that you feel this repetition, this constant repetition of fake news and, oh, they have it wrong and all this is actually working for Trump. I mean, do you think it is?
I think it does. I think...
let me just say the question was about whether the constant repetition of fake news works for Trump.
Yeah, I think it does work. I think it has worked, and I think it's a conscious strategy. I mean, Trump's a businessman who's always gotten whatever he wanted because he's led his own company. As president, you don't get to do that. There are other branches that are supposed to be balancing you, right? But he wants to basically disenfranchise and delegitimize these other branches. And he succeeded with Congress that is afraid to step up to him. So the only two that are left are really the judiciary and the press. The judiciary, I think, is willing to stand up to him, but as I say, there are more and more judges who now are his appointees. I mean, one of the problems in this whole issue that's going ahead with the wall and presidential power and emergency is that now two of the justices are people he's appointed who have histories of expanding presidential power. But he's trying to really minimize the press and give as little credibility to the press as possible, because the press is the one entity that's left that's doing most of the blocking of his agenda that he doesn't like. And so by giving us less and less credibility and minimizing our power and our trust with the citizens, he's doing that for a reason, that we're less of a roadblock in terms of what he wants to do, which is why when Bill earlier used the word autocrat, I mean, that's what's scary. The strategy is in part that he can do whatever he wants, which is what he's used to doing. And so it's a conscious strategy. It's not just, well, I'm going to call it fake news because it's cool, you know, it sounds good. I mean, sure, his base loves it, and his whole strategy is to be negative about everything. He doesn't really have a forward-looking, positive agenda. But I think the main reason is to really minimize the ability of the press to block him, and therefore that's why he does it, and that's why he does it continually.
Any other questions out here? Yes, right here.
Okay, so I have a question. It could be like a moral question. So what if these documents, the Pentagon documents, were actually harmful for some soldiers or people? Shouldn't they not be published, even though, like, knowing that publishing them is going to help stopping the war and help, like, saving people, soldiers?
Yeah, no, I think the answer is yes. I mean, as the...
Repeat the question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, the question was whether or not there is a moral obligation or an obligation on the part of the press to consider whether the documents that were leaked might do harm to soldiers or to military or to others. Is that a fair... Yeah.
Not only is it a good question, it's a question that Professor Bickel, when he was in the Supreme Court, was asked by one of the justices. He said, let's assume that as a result of your publication of these papers, 100 American soldiers would lose their lives. Would you still counsel your client, the Times, to publish these papers? And Bickel, who was a First Amendment scholar, constitutional law professor, said, as much as I have devoted my life to respecting, teaching about, and adoring the First Amendment, my love of humanity would come first, and I would counsel the Times not to publish those papers in that instance. But that's a hypothetical question. These papers deal with history, don't deal with current troop movements, and so we are convinced that they would not cost any lives whatsoever. And indeed, you know, whatever, 15 years ago when Bush 43 was in the White House, the Times had materials showing that there was a lot of warrantless wiretapping of Americans going on as part of the war on terror. This was about 5 years after 9/11, and President Bush summoned the publisher and the editor of the Times to the White House and said, if you publish the article you're about to publish about how we're tapping phone calls, you're going to have the blood of Americans on your hands if you go ahead and publish. And even if you didn't particularly like President Bush, those are pretty daunting words to hear across the table from the President of the United States. And the Times basically went through the documents. I mean, I was kind of consulted. They redacted certain things that maybe were too specific, but might have had problems both legally, because they were specific about telecommunications, which is stricter than the law that was at stake here, and might have caused problems. But generally, the view was the bad guys knew that we were tapping phone calls, so this wasn't like something that was going to change everyone's strategy. And they went ahead and published the articles a couple of weeks later, although the editor called me and said, I'm going to call the White House and tell them we're publishing tomorrow. And I said, geez, don't do that. Then they could go into court, just like they did in the Pentagon Papers, and try to get a prior restraint. And he said, I feel I have to as a matter of decorum, as a matter of diplomacy, because since I was there 2 weeks ago and we spoke about it, I should give him a heads up. So I suggested maybe that day the internet copy of the Times could go on the internet a few hours earlier than usual, so that there wouldn't be enough time for the government to go to court.
Jeff, do we have time for a couple more?
Maybe just one more.
One more question, okay. Professor Sharkey.
All right, so given the appointments to the current Supreme Court, how would the United States versus the New York Times be judged today, in your opinion?
Great question. Is given the current appointments to the Supreme Court, how would the decision be different now than it was back in 1971?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will answer it two ways. I would say that if, first of all, I should say that the current Supreme Court is actually a pretty pro-First Amendment court. The thing is, there haven't been many First Amendment media decisions, but in terms of videos of animals getting killed and demonstrations that are very unpopular by crazies, they've been very First Amendment protective. So my first instinct would be that it would be okay. On the other hand, this is a very pro-government Supreme Court, one that's even more pro-government because of the latest appointees. So my answer is that if this case didn't exist, in other words, if this was the first time the Supreme Court was ruling on a case like this, I would be pessimistic. I don't think they'd come out the same way. They would bend over backwards to side on behalf of the government. On the other hand, if this case really did come up next year, let's say, and the Pentagon Papers case was a precedent, I really believe they'd have no choice but to follow the precedent. And the precedent is that you could only stop publication, the court could only order a prior restraint, if they were sure that the publication would directly lead to irreparable and irrevocable damage to the nation or its people. And that's a really high standard, and I don't see how any Supreme Court, under facts that are similar to these, could find that. So if this precedent existed, as it does, I think the case would be decided the same way. Without the precedent, I wouldn't be terribly confident.
On that reassuring note, we'd like to thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Thank you very much.